sometimes it's a bit unsettling for us to know how to relate to God. One of my favorite stories is the story of a 4-year-old who was asked, "How do you know someone loves you?" And the response was, "When your name is safe on their lips." Wow.
4-year-old said that?
A 4-year-old said that.
It's amazing.
Would that we were wise as 4-year-olds. When your name is safe on their lips. You do know that God has a name. We sometimes forget to make God personal enough to have a name. The name of God matters to us, should matter to us. Because once we can give a person a name, we have in our own mind and heart given them place. Do you know what it's like to get to know someone to a point? You see them, you know them, you relate to them, but you don't know their name. Something happens the moment you get the name and it sticks. I've admired people that I've known through the years who had this amazing capacity to remember names. Dr. Eugene Stowe was the seminary president my senior year at NTS. He was president a couple of years while I was there. He came in the summer, began his work. By the time we met in our student orientation, Eugene Stowe could call every student by name.
And wife.
And Susan said he could call their wives by name. I was stunned by that capacity. I got to work very closely with him because in my senior year I was the student body president, so I met with him on a regular basis. And what I discovered was his capacity to remember names gave him an insight into people at a level that I had seldom seen with anyone else. When he got your name, he began to understand something about you because he studied your name. And so he used a method of remembrance by not only knowing your name, remembering your name, but understanding the meaning of your name, and then building a picture of you and the meaning of your name. And he said, I spoke to him years later when I was in one of the meetings with our board and the emeriti, and I said to Dr. Stowe, "Do you still remember the names of the students?" He said, "I probably could name every student by facial recognition today. Because," he said, "they are embedded in my memory by name, by meaning, and by picture." I thought that was an amazing insight. When I began to study the Gospel of John, I was asked to write a Sunday school lesson series for the Nazarene curriculum. And so I did and spent several months writing it. And then the feedback we got on it from those who had used it was so positive. They said, "Would you expand that and put it into some kind of book form?" So this is the outcome of that study. As I got into the study, one of the things I realized was that Jesus was very intentional about the way he used, according to John, the Gospel of John, Jesus was intentional about the way he used a particular self-reference. We've talked a little bit about it here. I think I covered it in a lesson one Sunday. But Jesus used a term that in Greek was ego eimi. I am. John wrote the Gospel of John toward the end of the first century. 80 to 100 AD, we believe, was the time frame. It would have been 10 to perhaps 30 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed at about AD 70. It has never been rebuilt. Lots of theological implications and all of that. But by the time this gospel was written, the Christian Jews were being thrown out of the synagogues. They no longer had a place. And the concern would be for everyone, what do we do? The temple is gone and now we have no access to the synagogue. And John was writing to say to them, you are never without his presence. As I was growing up, I remember the chorus of a song we sang often in our congregational singing. Some of you may remember it. The chorus went, no, never alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave us alone. I've loved that song. I love the rhythm of it because it just sings those phrases so beautifully. And it's something that would have mattered deeply to the Christian Jews. He was writing into the Jewish Christian community, trying to help them understand who Jesus was and what the implications of who he was had for those who had been very faithful and devout followers of Judaism, of God, of the Most High God. We still have to wrestle with the fact that Jesus is not just a good man. He was that. Jesus is not just a representation of God. In the Gospel of John, beginning with verse 1, we have these words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humanity. That phrase, that passage, to me is so significant because we begin to get a glimpse of what the writer of the Gospel of John is trying to say. When we follow Jesus, we are not just following someone who is somewhat an emanation from the God we previously were able to access in the temple. No, this is God himself. And he identifies himself. 7 times in the use of the term ego eimi, I am, Jesus used it in a phrase where there was an obvious application that intended to convey a realization. For instance, I am the bread of life. Those 7 sayings we have studied for thousands of years now. They have such profound meaning for us. But one of the disadvantages we have is that we speak English. And we have no idea what is behind the English in the writing of the Gospels. And behind the English in the writing of the Gospel of John, 27 times, the phrase, ego eimi, I am, is on the lips of Jesus. Several different times in surprising ways. In the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, there's that moment when he's being challenged by the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And he talked about knowing Abraham. And they said to him, you're not 50 years old, and you say you've seen Abraham? And you remember the response of Jesus? Before Abraham was, I am. Oh my word. If you read that as a Jew, you had to have alarm bells going off in your mind. Before Abraham was, I am. Who does he think he is? Maybe there's a better question. Who do you think he is? Something is going on here. That phrase, I am is important to us. It's important to us in the Old Testament. Let's go to the book of Exodus.
You lost us again.
There we are. Are we there? Okay. Go to the book of Exodus with me. You remember the story in chapter 3. Moses, and the backstory I'll not take a lot of time to get into, but now he, after many years, is a shepherd on the backside of the desert, and he was keeping sheep a long way from whatever home might have been. He's no longer in Egypt. He's had to flee Egypt. This is about 40 years after that. By this time, Moses is probably about 80 years old. I have great hope in that. He's keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. Let me stop right there. Do you know who this priest of Midian is? Do you get the connection for the priest of Midian? This is probably a descendant of Esau. This would be, the priest of Midian would be a priest of the God of Isaac, of Abraham. This would be another denomination, as we would refer to it, another family line. But when Moses got to Midian and met the priest of Midian, we sometimes read him to say, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land. And it's related in our minds often to the fact that he's referring back to Egypt. I was a foreigner in a foreign land. But sometimes we read it to be his statement about Midian. I'm a foreigner in a foreign land. My home is Egypt, and I'm a foreigner in a foreign land. In reality, it appears in the Hebrew structure of the verse that he is referring to the fact that in Egypt he was in the foreign land. But now that he's with the priest of Midian, he finds himself at home. The God of Abraham and Isaac is the tradition within which he finds himself. That's a rather staggering insight at times, because we have sometimes seen the concern, or I've been concerned about the fact that he seemed to be saying that his home was Egypt, when in reality the home is not Egypt. The home is anywhere where God is. Part of the problem for the Jews in their captivity in Egypt was the fact that after 400 years it would appear that while Gilead, that portion of Egypt where they had lived, while that area was home, after 400 years, the gods of Egypt were apparently stronger than the God of the Jews. 400 years. Now they're slaves and are crying out to God. And the divine Son of God, the Pharaoh, the divinity who sits on the throne, is the one who's in charge. And there's not a thing they can do. And if you get the mind of how people lived in that culture, in those cultures, the dominant God would be the God of the ruling class. And so the dominant God is the God of the pharaohs. The Isis, the bird god. Ra, the sun god. The Pharaoh, the god who sat on the throne. Those divinities seemed so much stronger. And the people are crying out to their God. And it doesn't seem like much is going on. Have you ever been in the place where crying out to God didn't seem to work? If any of us have lived very long, there are going to be times when it seems as if the heavens are brass and our prayers are falling to the floor faster than we can lift them. I wonder what it would be like to pray for 400 years. it is helpful to remember that God doesn't live in our time frame. God lives in the eternal now. And he's answering prayer in ways that we don't have any idea. The book of Revelation talks about bottled up prayers being poured out on the throne. This is one of those times where I believe the prayers were bottled up, and when Moses got to the right place, the prayers were poured out. So Moses is attending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He's out in the wilderness at the base of a mountain called Horeb. It is a long way from where he started. He had to travel to find the place where it could be safe. And not a lot of time to get into all the background of that, but that was just a long way from anywhere. It's dry land. We lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque, New Mexico is as near to the same topography and the kind of weather resources as you would find in the Middle East as any place else in the world. The land, the vegetation, very, very similar in so many ways. We lived there for several years. I've been now in both places and staggered at the similarities, especially the similarities of the arid, semi-arid desert areas, where good friends of ours were cattle ranchers. In the part of the country we came from, in the deep south, you talked about how many cattle per acre you could run. In New Mexico, they talk about how many acres per cow you could have. Dry grass. This was the kind of thing that kept the shepherds moving. That's why Moses was having to move from one place to the other. One of the things they feared was fire. Dry grass is explosive. If you've ever seen it catch fire, dry grass is explosive. There are oil weeds. Sometimes it gets so hot that an oil weed tree, a little brush, sometimes if it's hot enough and the wind is blowing hard enough, oil weed can burst into flame. It's dangerous. And then there's dry lightning. Dry lightning is the lightning that comes not because there's a rainstorm, but because the winds are blowing in such a way that the grit and dust in the air does the same thing that happens in the clouds. It creates electricity and it sparks, and dry lightning can start a fire in dry land without a cloud in sight. And so a shepherd was always watching for fire because you had to know which way the wind was blowing so you could move your flocks as quickly as possible and warn the family to move the tents and all this kind of thing. So when a flame begins to show and the bush is burning, I would imagine his blood pressure went up, his heart rate increased, his breathing was rather labored. Oh my word, which way is the wind blowing? And yet, as he looked, the bush was burning but not being consumed. That's an amazing picture to me. And then he is frightened by that, but wants to see what's going on, comes close to it, and then hears a voice. Which would be more terrifying, the fire or the voice? That's a staggering moment. And in this moment, he hears his name. That name means that he's been identified. That name means that the one who is calling out to him knows him. The use of his name has brought this from a rather broad category of something going on here to a very personal encounter. Moses. Take off your shoes. The ground on which you're standing is holy ground. And Moses throws his sandals and falls on his face. And he hears, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Oh, my word. What must that have been like? I mean, we all have probably in one way or another an encounter where we have no explanation for how or why God showed up just the way he did, but it was breathtaking. There are few of us who've had those experiences, or all of us probably to one extent or another. And it's a moment of insight, of sometimes fear, of grappling with meaning. What does this mean? And here's Moses. His name has been called. The bush is burning. The voice says, "This is holy ground," and identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, you know the rest of the story. He's told he is being called to go to speak to Pharaoh. Now, again, put all this in place. Pharaoh was after his head. He was going to kill Moses. But Moses is being sent back to Pharaoh by God. It is not always safe to follow God. Just thought I'd put that out there. It is not always safe to follow God. I used to say when I was a pastor to young people, follow the will of God. It is the safest place you could be. I had to quit saying that because some of those kids followed God, and it was not safe at all. It was disrupting. It was terrifying at times. And for you and me, if we follow God, if we really follow God, it will not necessarily be safe. It will be meaningful. It will be fulfilling sometimes. But it will not necessarily be safe. I'm sending you to the one who tried to kill you. Several faces came to mind. I won't go there. Moses asked the legitimate question, who am I? Now I want you to see a play on words here that begins to happen. Moses, and he said, "Here I am." Hear that? Here I am. Come no closer, remove the sandals. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses hid his face. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. Let me stop right here. I have observed. The Hebrew there is, I have experienced. God was not at a distance from his people. What they were going through, he went through. I have experienced the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. Do you hear what is going on here? I have heard their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them, to bring them up out of that land, to go to the country of the Canaanites, etc. The cry has come to me. I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to bring to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, but who am I? Here I am. Who am I? That I should go to Pharaoh, bring the Israelites out of Egypt. He said, and here it says, I will be with you. The phrase there is, ego eimi. I am with you. And this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. By the way, did you know that the mountain to which the Israelites went when they first got out of Egypt was Mount Horeb, right here.
Is Mount Horeb another name for Mount Sinai?
Yes, yes. Sinai and Horeb are the same mountain. Now look at this. But Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. What does that mean?
He is and always was and always will be.
He is,
Always was.
always was,
And always will be.
always will be. Yes.
He also knows exactly who he is, where so many of us are so splintered or dissociated that we don't know who we are, and the only person we can go to in reality is God, not somebody else who's just going to put another patch on us. He knows who he is, and we are his.
You know, some of the most fascinating people I know are the people who seem to have this innate understanding of who they are. I don't know a lot of people that really ever get there, but I have known a few. I've never met one that did not have an impact beyond what they were even aware of, because they understood who they were. That's not egotism. I've met a lot of egoists who thought they knew who they were, but it was a constant pretense. Constant pretense. But for those who know, it's remarkable. I am who I am. We've tried to find many different ways to define that, but I think you've caught it extremely well. I am the God who is. The most important characteristic of God, I believe, is his isness. Doesn't matter who, where, or when, God is. He is. He is life. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humanity, said the writer of the Gospel of John about Jesus. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Put those two together for a few moments. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations. Let's stop right there for a moment. Will you notice the way this is written? Capital letters, larger L, but O-R-D in caps. You see, it's not that way in other words, but in this word. It's always that way in the Old Testament. Whenever you see that in the Old Testament, you will know that that is a reference to the name of God, to the person of God, to that phrase, this title, this name that he has self-identified. I am. Am is a, yes.
Is this his first introduction? Would the people of Israel know what I am? Would they say, well, that's God's name? Or is he introducing a new name to them?
It appears that this is the first time he's used it just this way as the self-identifier. He's identified himself to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He has revealed himself, you remember in the 15th chapter of the book of Genesis, where the great covenant is established with the smoking fire pot and the blazing torch walking through the sacrifices. He doesn't use his name there. He just says the Lord, the compassionate, gracious God. In other passages, the Lord, always using this terminology from this point forward, always using this terminology. Not used that way unless there is an attempt by the, usually the translators, to go back in and read meaning into the way the name of God or the reference to God is being used. But this is primarily from this point forward that he's identified this way to Israel.
I just always wondered how the people of Israel would have identified, oh yeah, that's Jehovah, that's Yahweh, because of that name, unless it was not new to them.
That's a great place to wrestle. And it's a great place for us to wrestle with what it means for us to pass along the faith. What are we passing along? Abraham had an encounter with God. We don't know that God identified himself by this name. But he did identify with the person, with the God, with the deity. The same thing occurred with Isaac and Jacob. Israel, as he became, wrestling with the Lord until he was crippled, literally. We don't have a reference to the name, but we have a reference to the encounter. What it appears to be in those encounters and for the years that would follow, the generations that would follow, was that the reference was to the encounter. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob encountered God. What his name was, there are a variety of different names by which he's known in other places in the Old Testament, and some interesting studies of the varieties of resources by which the Old Testament came to us. But one of the things that is pretty clear is that this becomes the time when God, who appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, identifies himself in such a way that from this point forward there is a name given. There doesn't seem to have been the name conveyed in any other place until here. It's a fascinating study to watch. It's also something fascinating to me when we begin to think about passing along the faith. What is it we're passing along? Is it just a memory of events and moments? Or are we able to pass along an encounter, a relationship?
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I think it's relationship.
Yeah.
Because without that, it's just hearsay.
It's just
Yeah,
another
that's
religion.
right. And that was the thing that happened for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There was an encounter.
Right.
There was a relationship.
Connection.
Yeah,
That they could pass on the knowledge of that
yeah.
to other humans.
Mhm.
And no, they were supposed to do that too. I mean,
Yeah.
they were given instruction to do that, right?
Yes, right. Oh, yes,
At the
by all
earliest
means.
time.
And they were to be the light to all the nations. This was the God they were to reveal to all the peoples. And here, I think another thing that we sometimes are a little hesitant to embrace is the fact that this whole encounter up until this point is a part of the opening revelation, the continuing revelation of God. God didn't lay the whole load on humanity, not because God wasn't capable, but because humanity was not ready. What does it mean for Jesus to have appeared in the fullness of time?
Just a thing that's in my brain. Question, verse 2, where it says the angel of the Lord was in the midst of the, and then he identifies himself as God.
Mm-hmm.
So the angel of the Lord in that case, that phraseology,
Yeah.
that often is in the scripture as like a theophany or something.
It's God appearing.
Okay.
The angel of the Lord is probably not the... If we could translate it better, it would be the presence of the Lord.
Oh, okay.
It is a manifestation of the Lord. An angel of the Lord is one of the ways. The book of Revelation is very similar in reference to the churches, the 7 churches. The angel of the church. It's the manifestation of. It is the substance of, the person of this church that is being referred to. And
Which asked me another question. You said that the book of John was written at the end of the first century.
Mhm.
There's 2 thoughts about when the book of Revelation was written. Was it after John or before John?
There are 2 thoughts.
Two
Yeah,
schools of
and my
thought.
response is yes. Yeah, we don't know. We don't have enough precision. What we do know is that Revelation is related to what is given to us in the Gospel of John. The reorientation of life to see what happens in this world when things are happening as they are in the culture, in the politics, in the empire. And we're not into the Revelation, but my quick overview is Revelation is not about what is going to happen, it is about what happens every day. It is now.
It kind of gives light to Gospel of John, to have it written after Revelation, in my mind, it has kind of value that way. 'Cause
There's some commentators that would agree with you fully. Yeah, yeah, very much so. And yet, and again, it's a little tough to identify the writer of the Gospel of John with the Apostle John if you take a lot of the historical data in place. So you've got to wrestle with what all that means. Is this one of the disciples of John, which could well have been? But at the same time, the timing on the two of them is crucial, and they obviously in some ways are related. They're quite obviously related in some ways. And I wish we had time to get into that. That would be fun. Yes?
Thank you.
So, in thinking about God saying, I am,
Mhm.
at this juncture, I think about this is sort of the beginning of the process where the nation is freed and where they get the covenant of God through the Ten Commandments. So is the timing of this like crucial in that regard?
It's extremely crucial because remember that Moses is considered for Israel the supreme prophet. Moses, one of the things that was so difficult for many of the Jews to accept was someone talking about Jesus being greater than Moses. That didn't fit. There was no one greater than Moses. And yet it was Moses himself who said, there's a prophet like me who's coming. And to put all that together was difficult for them. We're not going to get through all I wanted to get through, but let's go here. I would encourage you to do something in your devotional reading sometime this week. Go to some of the Psalms where reference is made to the Lord. And the wording is this capital L-O-R-D. And in that place, just in your own mind, read it, the I am. And see what it says to you. It suddenly brings it to a little more focus because there is the word I am, Yahweh. Quickly, let me get to that word in Hebrew. Yahweh is very close to the word am in Hebrew.
Say that again. It went-
Yahweh sounds like am in Hebrew. And you almost can't say Yahweh, you almost have to breathe it. Yahweh. It was such a sacred name that many of the Jews would not ever say the word. They would not even write the word. They would put in what is called the tetragrammaton. They would put in 4 letters that would imply the name. But the word Yahweh sounded like if you breathed it as you spoke it. What the Jews would say when they would say of themselves, well, I am Jess, I am Mike. And when we say that, all of a sudden, it brings it to a little different kind of realization. Every time they thought, I am, they had to think of the name of God. God's name was around them all the time. And at times, you and I need to breathe the name Yahweh. I am. And personalize God away from this being in the heavens to the one who is right here with us. Every breath I breathe comes from Him. Maybe one of the best words for Yahweh, the Lord, is the present one. Always here. Always here. No, never alone. He promised never to leave us. Never to leave us alone. For people who thought they'd been forgotten, what better news could there be than I am here. Thanks be to God. No wonder we could pray, Our Father. When you pray it next time, remember this. God has a name. And He knows your name. Father, thank you for knowing us so well, that we may trust your presence here with us. Help us as we get into this material to allow you to speak clearly, directly, lovingly to us. As we study the I am sayings of Jesus, may it bring new meaning to your love for us. We pray in the strong, matchless name of Jesus. Amen. Well, we'll start on the I ams next week. All right.